Real people, real opinions.
Real Talk Radio, the multi-award-winning Niall Boylan Show.
Ireland's classic hits.
The law student Simeon Burke has been convicted of an offence under the Public Order Act and fined £300 following his arrest during a disturbance at the Court of Appeal last month. Found guilty. Guilty. Meanwhile, our good friend Gerry Hutch, the monk, walks free from court, a free man found not guilty of murder by the non-jury Special Criminal Court of killing Mr. Byrne in the notorious attack at the boxing weigh-in over 7 years ago. Joining me to tell me a little bit more about it is Paul Williams, crime journalist with the Irish Independent and author of The Monk. I was going to say good afternoon to you, Gerry. Paul, good evening to you.
Good evening. Good night. How are you?
What a very confusing day. But if I was a betting man, I would have put money on the outcome of this case because I think it was obvious from the start what was going to happen. Or am I wrong in thinking that?
No, I think, it was particularly, obviously, the core of this case all suddenly revolved around Jonathan Dowdall and him becoming a so-called supergrass and giving evidence against Gerry Hutch's former...
Which wasn't accepted
friend.
In isolation, that particular
No.
evidence.
And it can't anyway, but he became the central plank of this case and was the ultimate plank in this case because he was completely discredited as a liar and a perjurer. And the judges didn't hold back in how they were describing him. You may recall that Jonathan Dowdall was one time convicted of torturing a man in his home, including waterboarding him and threatening to cut his fingers off and tying him up and generally terrorising him, telling him he'd kill him and bring him up to north and bury him. But they referred to that today, the judges, as ruthless, base, refer to him as a ruthless, base, callous criminal.
Yeah,
I very rarely ever heard judges coming out to describe a witness in such a way. So he was completely discredited. Normally, you can't accept the uncorroborated word of a state or a participating individual, because remember, he was originally charged with murder along with Gerry Hutch of David Byrne in the Regency Hotel in February 2016. And he did the deal basically to get the charge dropped, and he would then testify in court. And the judges said they just literally could not believe a word he said.
So the words from Justice Tara Burns, the presiding judge in the case, that the court was satisfied that the members of the Hutch family were responsible for the Regency attack, but they were not satisfied beyond a reasonable doubt that Gerard Hutch was guilty of murder, and as head of the family, he was taking responsibility. In other words, that they believed that he was being given the responsibility of this crime. So they couldn't find it beyond a reasonable doubt that he was the murderer.
That's correct. And one of the criticisms by the defence, Brendan Grehan, when he was closing his speech in the trial, was that he said he accused the state of basically riding two horses. You have to remember, originally, the file sent to the DPP about 2020. Dowdall only changed his tack in the summer of, say, July, August, and right up to the last few days before the Hutch trial started in October of last year. And he was, at that time, they were both charged with murder. Now, at that stage, the only evidence the state had was based on these famous 10 hours of secretly recorded conversations between Hutch and Dowdall when they drove to meet the IRA to intervene in the feud on March the 7th, 2016. Now, that was the case originally. So the state felt that it was strong enough a case at that stage.
But wasn't there question marks? Sorry for interrupting you. Was there question marks raised over the validity of that evidence, of those recordings, and permission that was sought through the courts to put those recording devices, or the manner in which those recording devices were put into the car in the first place? There was questions asked over that, wasn't there?
There were questions, yeah, but the court ruled that it was in the interest of justice, and that was primarily because of the fact that a lot of the material was recorded when they were in a different jurisdiction. But in the interest of justice, the court ruled that would be admissible. Mm-hmm. But having said that, like the defence did say, there was nowhere in that in those tapes that I had heard, and my colleagues did a much better job. But they were 5 or 6 of them. They're feverishly trying to write this stuff down over 3 days. But nowhere in any of the transcripts that emerged from that, or evidence that emerged from it. Could you see any smoking gun in relation to Gerry Hutch admitting to anything? The only thing that was absolutely unambiguous was the fact that he had complete control over the 3 AK-47s that had been used in the Regency Hotel. He's talking quite openly at the table about throwing them up as a present to the real IRA, and basically saying as well, I remember in the tape, he says, down the road, these things will be used by the IRA, presumably to shoot RUC or PSNI, he called them RUC, but PSNI officers, and when they do the ballistic checks on them, they say, that those weapons were also used in the Regency, so there go, they'll associate the Regency then with the continuity IRA. This is what was said on tape, but as the judges said in their summing up, Gerry Hutch was only charged with one specific offence, that of murder. He wasn't charged with possession of firearms.
So isn't this what people had said? The guards obviously wanted to charge him with murder because they wanted him to go down for a long time if found guilty. But if he had been brought up on a lesser charge, maybe got 5 or 6 years on a lesser charge in possession of firearms or whatever it is, I mean, that might have stuck to him. But it was because they went for the murder charge. Now, is he now being investigated, and is there a possibility that he'll be rearrested for other charges?
I really don't think so, because there are 2 outstanding charges there, but a lot of people are asking questions for some time now as to why he wasn't charged with all the relevant offences. Mm-hmm. And they seem to put their eggs all into one basket. I'm sure that would be all part of the post-Gerry Hutch acquittal debate that will take place now. For his sake, for his part, Gerry Hutch, I'm sure, is a very happy man tonight. And he's probably starting to celebrate his 60th birthday, which fell last week.
Well, if he doesn't get a flight to Lanzarote before that. But here's the thing. I'm noticing on social media, on many of the different crime journalists' posts that are put up on social media today, particularly on Twitter, the majority of people congratulating Gerry Hutch. Well done, Gerry. Isn't this great news? Now, I don't know whether that's an anti-Garda sentiment or people still have this belief that he's an ordinary, decent criminal.
Well, I think that there's quite a bit of sympathy for Hutch, and certainly a lot of sympathy for the Hutch family. Hutch would be, and I can take the blame, partly the blame for this. I would always describe him as being the least worst in the pantheon of criminals. He would be the last standing, as I said in the Irish Independent today or this evening, that he's the last standing ODC, and that was an ordinary decent criminal where they actually adhere to some kind of basic standards.
Was he the guy in the movie, in the Veronica Guerin movie, the portrayal of him in the Veronica Guerin movie was of this guy who cooperated with Veronica Guerin, was very friendly towards her, helped her out, and walked around looking like a gentleman almost. Was he that guy?
Oh, he was, yeah. Gerry Hutch he was never a grandstanding, glad-handling criminal godfather who'd go around the place intimidating people. If you pissed them off and you crossed them, absolutely. I'm sure there were people who did that through the years and didn't end up very well, but not a lot of people ever did do it because he had that kind of presence, but he always avoided trouble. Now, having said all of that, the Hutch family, as the court found out today, the Hutch crime family, was responsible for that horrendous act that went on. The Regency was the worst and the most dramatic example of violence ever in the history of what we call organised crime in Ireland, and that's about 50 years old now at this stage. Mm-hmm. So it was quite an extraordinary crime. But then, you see, it was the fight back, so the counter-offensive then from the
And what was the reason for David Byrne's murder in the Regency? Was that in retribution for what's seemingly, you would know more about this than I do because you obviously write about it all the time, what happened in Mountjoy Jail was to Gerry Hutch's nephew. So was that in retaliation for that?
Oh no, it wasn't just in retaliation. It was the law of the jungle, because what had happened was, just to remind your listeners, is that the Gerry Hutch and other members of the clan went to kill Daniel Kinahan in August of 2014. And that was because I think they felt that he was coming to kill Gary. And then a deal was done for his life with Gerry Hutch involved, and one of them had to present himself to be shot in the legs in punishment, one of the suspected shooters. And then they went and reneged on the deal, and they shot him dead, Gerry Hutch, in 2015. And what they then did was they tried to kill Patsy Hutch on the same day, but then followed that up by trying to murder Gerry Hutch himself in Lanzarote. Now, that was considered a step way, way too far. And as a result of that, that's where the Regency came from. And the reason the Regency was done was that, like, it glorified St. Valentine's Day Massacre, because it was to wipe out all of the higher levels of the Kinahan gang in one fell swoop. And they didn't succeed. They didn't realise there were so many doors to that. They didn't plan it quite as meticulously as they were famous for.
I mean, his background, Gerry Hutch, I mean, he comes from a pretty poor background. He's not poor now, you can be sure of that. But he comes from a pretty poor background. His dad, I think, worked on the docks. They moved to Summerhill around the 70s. And he was part of a gang as a young man. And I remember years ago hearing some interview that they played in RTE, and he was only 16 at the time. And even then, he said he couldn't give up robbing, and if he seen money, he'd take it. But he did also say in that interview that he wouldn't go near people walking down the street. So the sentiment never changed. So he was always involved in some sort of skullduggery.
Well, he was sucked into the criminal justice system like a lot of his peers from around I think his first conviction was 8 when he robbed a bottle of lemonade. A very inauspicious start for what turned out to be quite a career in the end. And he was running with he was running with a bunch of young lads from in the mid 1970s. They were called the Bugsy Malones after that famous kids movie that we would have watched Niall, when we were.
I remember that. Yes,
when we were kids, gangster movie for kids it was. But
what was her name? Tallulah. Was it Tallulah? Wasn't it? That was the girl. Bugsy Malone and Tallulah. Yeah.
But so then he always stood out from the rest of the crowd. He has a lot of very positive traits about him as a criminal. Like, for example, he was running in armed robberies in 15, 16, 17 years of age with older criminals because they saw the talent he had, Morial, what you want to call it, talent for want of a better word. But he was different from the criminals so many other ways. Like, he started saving money at a very young age. When he was taking robberies, he was banking it. And when his then girlfriend, Patricia, became pregnant and had their first child in December, I think it was 1983. He's 19, I think, at the time. And he went and bought a house for his girlfriend and his new child. Mm-hmm. Which, think about it. Here you have a tearaway young fella, and he has the will.
And he's investing in the money. Yes.
Strategically, yeah. So, and when he got involved in other bigger robberies, he continued to invest. And then he moved his family. He bought a house out in Clontarf, in leafy middle-class Clontarf, and he reared the kids there, and he reared them there because he didn't want them coming following in his footsteps. He wanted them to have everything that they could have, and he educated them very well. And some of the daughters are very, very successful people in the world of business now, and because of the education they got. So, that's something that can sometimes get lost in translation.
And by the way, is it true? Because
justifies any of the nasty stuff, by the way.
I know, of course not. But I mean, he's 60 years of age now. Actually, he's born the same year as me, 1963. I'm 60 this year as well. Okay, so he was born the same year as me. But the last time he was in jail, with the exception of this time, of course, that he's been obviously on remand for this particular crime. And I'll talk to you about that in a second, because somebody mentioned to me today, will he get compensated for that? But the last time he was in jail was when he was 20 years of age. So he hasn't been in jail, really, since he was 20 up to now.
He left prison in 1985 for the last time. So do the maths from that.
Yeah.
Got to try 40 years, yeah. And so he and one of the things that again left him different from others, or defined him out from the rest of the crowd, was that he planned everything very carefully. He was always in control, and he also inspired great loyalty, so that there were hermetically sealed sort of sub-unit that he had, like an active service unit, for want of a better description, of criminals around him, and they all knew each other. They were all old Bugsy Malones, and they'd grown up together, and they all trusted each other. But then what they were doing was armed robberies. They weren't doing drugs. Like, and the drug trade is what has caused all the troubles in gangland, so to speak, when criminals are killing each other. It's all about drugs and money. But when you're robbing a finite amount of money, a cash van can only hold so much money, and you can only divide it up amongst the lads. So all of that avoids trouble. But he did, and again, it's notable, and he's very touchy on this, and I don't know why. Even though he keeps in the company of a lot of very nasty drug dealers through the years, he has eschewed the heavy drug trade.
So he's never been involved in selling drugs, which is the go-to for most criminals. Yeah,
yeah, because he saw how heroin, in particular, destroyed. Like, it was his generation. They were in the way, the path of the storm when it blew up, the firestorm. That was the heroin crisis when it started in 1979 into 1980, in particularly in the north side. Like in the north inner city, it took about a month, 2 months to get a hold. Like, it was dramatic, and several of his cousins died. I remember interviewing some of them before they died. One of his cousins had lost 2 fingers, he'd lost a leg, he had HIV, he had hepatitis, he was dying, and his whole family had been wiped out, and they were cousins of Gerry Hutch's. So, like, he had seen all of that. So all of that then goes back to the paradigm, as I say, about the least worst within the pantheon.
But you know what? I was myself and Jane were talking about it. My producer earlier on. We were having a chat, and I was telling her all about Gerry Hutch, and I was saying the most bizarre situation was, although of course he was suspected of being involved in 2 of the country's biggest heists, which he denies, despite several investigations and arrests, he was never actually prosecuted for anything. However, in 1999, he settled with the Revenue Commissioners, the Criminal Assets Bureau, for 1.2 million. And we're trying to get our head around this. Only in Ireland could somebody pay tax on an alleged robbery. I mean, where else would that happen?
Well, that was because we were groundbreaking in the sense that we were the first country in the Western Europe, and there were so many ironies for Gerry Hutch, because he had reached out to Veronica Geary because he was giving out shit about some story I'd written about the Sunday World at the time, if I remember correctly, and he gave it to Veronica, and he got on really well with her. And when she was murdered, he completely disagreed with it, and he publicly displayed his disapproval by queuing with the ordinary citizens of Dublin to sign the Book of Condolences for Veronica in June of 1996. But the irony of ironies was that the stark realization that we had here as a society about how organised crime had got a grip and was getting out of control was that we began to realize the only way to tackle them is by the money, and that's it was direct consequence of Veronica's murder that the Criminal Assets Bureau was set up, and the first target of it was John Gilligan. However, the first proper scheduled target, so to speak, he was an immediate emergency. Gilligan was, but it was Gerry Hutch, and it was called Operation Alpha. The very first, and over 40 million euros, 40 million pounds at the time, was taken ultimately in the first 10 years of CAB. 40 million euro from him and his associates. But as he quite rightly pointed out himself in an interview with Paul Reynolds on RTE some years ago, Paul Reynolds put it to him, "Well, you're still a wealthy man." He says, "Oh God, Jesus, I couldn't leave me and me nude." In other words,
but if I remember rightly, there was a photograph in the paper at the time. I think the Revenue Commissioners were up in Mount Street, and wasn't there a photograph of him in the paper walking up Mount Street with a suitcase in his hand, or a briefcase?
So what happened was, no, you're nearly right. He actually went down a street in the north inner city to a bank. I think it was down on Talbot Street or somewhere like that. And he was watched by the ERU and Criminal Assets Bureau officers and people on roofs and everything, because he was walking to the bank with 500,000 in cash as part settlement. But they were watching him really, really closely in case he pulled a stroke and suddenly became victim of a mugging and had the rucksack taken to his back. So here was Gerry Hutch for the first time ever in his life, one of the most celebrated arm robbers. It was great crack at the time. I know we shouldn't really be laughing because it was morally ambivalent of us, but he walked into a bank for the first time in his life with a bag of cash and handed it over for the law to take off him.
To pay tax. To pay tax on it, yes. It also, but see, it does come back to what we were saying about the ordinary decent criminal. And certainly we're not endorsing crime or suggesting for 1 minute that crime pays, although you would have reason to believe that with the way that the justice system works in this country sometimes. So what now for Gerry Hutch? I mean, the question that was asked me today, and I didn't actually know the answer, was, will he be compensated now for the time that he's been on remand for a crime that he didn't commit?
No, it's the short answer.
So what happened? Sorry, you just lost a year and a half off your life. Tough.
No, that's it, yeah. Because the reason he was incarcerated during that time wasn't out on bail was because he was seen as a flight risk, and he had been living in Spain, and had to be extradited. So that's the reason why he was refused bail.
It seems a bit unfair, but I mean, genuinely, if you're not guilty of a crime and you're arrested for it and you're incarcerated for a period of time and then you're found not guilty, it seems a little bit unfair that you don't get compensated for that time that you've been put away.
Well, I suppose if there was evidence of a miscarriage of justice, it would be argued very strongly that this isn't a miscarriage of justice, that the state took Jonathan Dowdall on face value. They had all these tapes of him discussing what he was discussing, and he was prepared to testify in court, so they brought him in. So, there was no, it wasn't a manufactured case. It wasn't a miscarriage of justice within that category.
Right.
So that's how the game works. But Gerry Hutch would look at this very much like this on the chin, and he'd be quite happy to get the hell out of town. He won't be.
Well,
around
he's
too much.
refuted to own properties worth what, about 12 million across the European Union, Eastern Europe, and the UK, and of course Spanish real estate as well.
Well, he's going to. This was definitely the closest shave he's certainly ever had in his life. And I suppose last week he was looking down the barrel of the abyss, so to speak, because he was thinking, you know, he's 60 years of age. If he got life imprisonment, he'd serve at least 20.
Yeah.
So the rest of his life would have been spent in prison. The rights and wrongs of how the state handled it, and also, as well, it's also important to keep reminding people that, you know, we're not justifying in any shape, make, or form because what he ever did, because an awful lot of people were terrorised when they were being robbed at gunpoint, and we keep forgetting about those people. So, and also, ultimately, Gerry Hutch's legacy was embodied in his nephews. You know, the likes of Gary Hutch, who was murdered. Because Gerry Hutch became a ruthless drug dealer, and one of the reasons he was so ruthless was because he was trying to follow in his uncle's footsteps and be a hard man, only he went for the drug trade, and the rest of that is history. So he and they spawned an awful lot of trouble. So it's not blameless, it's not victimless.
Real people, real opinions.
Real Talk Radio, the multi-award winning Niall Boylan Show.
Ireland's classic hits.
McCarthy Insurance Group, serving the community for over 70 years. For home, farm, motor, life, health and business insurance, log on to mig.ie or free phone 1800 50 11 11. Probably your best call in 2024. Charles McCarthy Insurance is trading as McCarthy Insurance Group, is regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland.